Al Condeluci. Welcome back to our video series on community building and social capital issues. I'm the CEO of Class Community, an organization here in Western Pennsylvania that provides services to men, women, and children with disabilities, all types of disabilities, really looking to get people included and connected in the greater community. And we'd call your attention to Class Community. Take a look at our website and look at some of the good things that we're doing. Today in our video series, we're really talking about framing of the problem. You know, one of the things that have happened time immemorial for people with disabilities is that they have been perceived from a notion of their deficits or their problems. If somebody has a disability, most of the attention, most of the focus looks at their dysfunction as the problem. We at Class disagree with that premise. We actually think all people have problems in some way, shape, or form. And when we focus attention on people's dysfunction, we actually make things more challenging for people to be a natural part of community than we actually facilitate that. And so what I want to do today is I want to really talk about how we can reframe the challenge of our work. If you work with vulnerable people, or if you happen to be a person with this disability, how we can reframe the notion from something that looks at problems to really thinking more from an asset and a relevance base. And so what we want to do is really kind of share with you a paradigm shift, if you will, in terms of thinking. That oftentimes for people with disabilities, the focus of attention and the way the person's issues are looked at come really from a micro model or a therapeutic model that literally looks at their issue in a very narrow way. For example, in a micro model, and by the way, you know, I've experienced this in my own life with relatives, my cousin Carrie, who had Down syndrome, my dad, who had Parkinson's. When the system introduced their situation, the very first thing that they said was the problem was the person with the disability. In the case of my family, the problem was my cousin Carol, or the problem was my dad. And the locus of the problem was actually seen to be in the person. In other words, the intentionality was to say, these guys have a problem, and that problem is inside them. Consequently, all the actions that manifest from a micro model or a micro perspective, those actions are very, very microscopic. The very first thing that we do is we assess the problem, right? We do an assessment of somebody's dysfunction. How much my dad shook, or my cousin Carol's inability to do something. And then once we do the assessment, we oftentimes will create a treatment plan. That treatment plan is tied to the assessment of the problem. The assessment also creates a diagnosis, a title, a label that somehow suggests the difference of the person. And then lastly, from the treatment plan, we then do some kind of separation or segregation of the person into programs. Now these are classic micro paradigmatic approaches to disability. And we really feel that they create a great dysfunction. Because usually what happens is the person who's in charge of this usually is some expert, somebody who has I don't know, a title, a degree, they have some certification, and they know about this person's problem, and consequently the goal is to try to fix the problem, right? Now that micro paradigm is one way to frame an issue, and if somebody has a medical problem, it's oftentimes viable. However, if your organization is really looking to try to help people, or if you're looking to try to help people live full and productive lives in community, then this micro paradigm doesn't work. Rather, we want to suggest the consideration of a macro paradigm, and this is what we do here at Class. The framing of the problem is not the person with the disability, but rather how relevant or maybe irrelevant that person with the disability is in the greater community. If somebody is rendered irrelevant, then that changes the whole framework. Because the locus of the problem in a macro perspective is the community itself and the need to try to address the community or to change the community. That's really what macro change is. It implies that changes the greater culture and the environment as opposed to micro change, which focuses on just trying to change a person, right? So in macro change, the very first framing of the problem is not that Carol Condeluci has Down syndrome or Mr. Condeluci has Parkinson's, but that Carol Condeluci or Mr. Condeluci is perceived to be irrelevant because of their disability. Now, if you buy that, that sets the target of really not being the person like the micro model, but really looking at changing the community. And we see three major actions to try to do this, and at class we actually incorporate these issues. The first action is, rather than to look at somebody's problems or assess their dysfunctionality, what are people's assets, interests, passions, hopes, dreams? Who is Carol Condeluci and what does she really like? What does she want to do? That becomes the critical start point. Not seeing her Down syndrome as a problem, but really saying, how do we create a bridge for Carol Condeluci to the greater community? The second step is really looking at finding a venue or a place in the greater community that Carol can relate to. That venue is really a bridge. And then lastly, in terms of action, is we're really looking at how can we get Carol then connected to the people in the venue. And we do that in a couple ways. We do that by really focusing on what are the expected behaviors of the venue, and then finding a gatekeeper, someone who actually can facilitate the connections. Now, of course, in charge of all this is the person with the disability. They know what they like. They know what they're excited about. They are, you know, if you just sit and ask, you can discover all these wonderful possibilities in terms of this asset orientation. And then, of course, the goal of all this is not to fix some kind of a problem, but to really help people build friendships and relationships. We call that social capital. We know that when people have social capital, their lives are better. We have a whole video that actually talks about social capital. You might want to check it out if you're interested in this issue. And so I want to thank you for taking a look at some of these videos and thinking more about how we can change the paradigm of disability, so that rather than looking at people's problems and trying to fix those problems, we're really focusing on people's assets and using that as a bridge to the community. I'm Al Condeluci with Class Community. I thank you for taking a look at this. I invite you to look at some of the other things we're doing. Have a great day.